From the halls of Montezuma, Kansas, that is, to wherever you may be, this is the Sure and Secure Podcast, a ministry of Morningside Community Church, helping you become sure that Christianity is true and that your salvation is secure through Jesus Christ. I'm Pastor Tim Erickson. Thanks for listening today. Hello, and welcome to the podcast today. If this is your first time listening, I want to say thank you for giving me the opportunity to perhaps teach you something today. If you have, by chance, listened to all of the episodes so far, well, let me just say, thanks, Mom. I'll call you later. Now, on the last episode, I started to talk about this statement. We can know the truth about reality, and reality insists that there is a God. We saw that to deny the first part of that statement is just self-contradictory. If you claim we cannot know the truth about reality, what you're really saying is, here's something that I know to be true about reality, that we cannot know the truth about reality. That statement contradicts itself, and so it cannot possibly be true. And so we have to affirm that we can know some true things about reality. And so that then inspires us to start looking around reality to see what else we might discover to be true. And one of the things that we ought to discover from reality is that there is a God. So on today's podcast, I'm going to start talking about making an argument for the existence of God. Now, please keep in mind that in this context, when I talk about making an argument, I'm not talking about an angry conversation. I'm not talking about shouting and screaming and fighting with someone. In fact, the Bible forbids us from speaking to other people in that way. Colossians chapter 4, verses 5 and 6 say this, "Walk in wisdom toward outsiders, making the best use of the time. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person." Salt makes our food palatable, right? It makes it tasty. It makes you want to come back for more. That's why the old potato chip commercial works. Once you pop, you can't stop, right? You get that salty taste on your tongue, and you just want more and more. What a profound way to describe our conversations with other people. We want to speak to others, and here in the context, it's talking about outsiders or non-Christians. We want to speak to those who do not believe in a way that will make them want to keep coming back to us for more conversation, to talk more and more about the things that we believe. 1 Peter chapter 3 echoes this idea. Verses 15 and 16 say this, "In your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect, having a good conscience, so that, when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame." So the Bible gives us no license to get into angry shouting matches with people over theology. Well, we're not supposed to try to club anybody over the head and drag them to faith in Christ. We are supposed to be winsome, persuasive. Yes, we can certainly speak with great passion and conviction about the things that we believe, but we're always supposed to speak in a way that is respectful. So again, when I talk about making an argument for the existence of God, I'm not talking about an angry shouting match. I'm talking about something that we could just call making a case. Think of your favorite courtroom drama on TV when they show the prosecutor making a closing argument. That's the same kind of context that we're thinking of here when we use the term argument, as in making an argument for the existence of God. When the prosecutor makes his closing argument, what's he doing? He's pulling together the facts that he believes supports his case. He's trying to make his case to the jury, right? Pull together the facts in order to prove a point. And that's what we are trying to do when we make an argument for the existence of God. We are trying to pull observable facts from reality around us and bring them together in a logical way in order to prove the point that God really does exist. Another common phrase for an argument like this would be a train of thought. And that's a pretty interesting analogy. With a train, you have one car pulling another car along, and that car pulls another car along, and there's a definite connection between all of those cars. So that's an interesting analogy for making an argument. When we have a train of thought, we think of one idea or claim pulling along another idea behind it, and then a third idea coming along as well. And of course, with a train of thought, it's moving somewhere, right? It's meant to take us somewhere in order to prove a point. Now, an argument can be arranged in a formal way into what we call premises and a conclusion. The conclusion would be the point that you're trying to make. That's the point that you're trying to prove. And the premises would be the observations you point to in order to make your case. Now, here's a very common example of a formal argument from logic textbooks. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Now, the statement that comes after therefore is the conclusion. That's the point you're trying to prove. And then the first two statements are the premises. That's the observations you point to in order to prove your point. Now, out in the wild, in common conversation in life, you will almost never encounter an argument stated formally that way. That kind of structure is the sort of thing reserved for books, and even then, usually just for textbooks in logic or philosophy. Normally, in common conversation, that argument about Socrates would sound something more like this. Since Socrates is a man, he's not going to live forever. Or you might hear it stated even more informally, something like, Socrates is going to die someday, you know. That person is trying to get a point across to you. They're trying to remind you of something that they take to be true, and they want you to take it as true as well. Now, it's a very helpful critical thinking skill to learn how to take a claim from a conversation and separate out the premises and the conclusion. That allows you to think about the flow of logic that the person is leaning on to try to make his point. It's a really helpful way to help you see if that person has made any logical mistakes, what we call fallacies or errors. So as you read something, even a news report or some kind of nonfiction book, and the author's trying to prove a point, or if you think back on a conversation you had with someone, it can be really insightful and enlightening to ask yourself two questions. What's the point he's trying to make? And how does he try to convince me about this point? What's the point he's trying to make? That would help you identify the conclusion of the argument. And then ask yourself, how does he try to convince me about his point? That would help you see the premises in the argument. That would help you focus on the observations that he is leaning on in order to try to prove his point. Again, that's a very helpful exercise to go through when you're trying to understand how someone is trying to persuade you, if you'll go through that exercise, then that will allow you to think more clearly about how someone is trying to convince you and whether or not you should actually agree with that person about the case they're trying to make. All right, enough about that before I bore you to death with it. In the rest of this episode, I want to mention 11 observations that people have used at different times to argue for the existence of God. We're going to just briefly talk about each of these observations. And then in the next episode, I'm going to do a deep dive on just one argument for the existence of God, what we call a moral argument for God's existence. In that kind of argument, we are looking at the reality of objective moral standards that we're supposed to live by. And we think about that in order to discover what that shows us about the nature of reality and the fact that reality must be the product of a God who created us. But as I said, we'll dive more deeply into that in the next episode. But for this episode, let me just briefly introduce you to these 11 observations that have been used to argue for the existence of God. We could separate them into a few different categories. The first being observations about the universe. The first observation would be about the beginning of the universe. It is widely accepted today that our universe began to exist. Now, of course, that's a belief held by Christians. We believe that God created the heavens and the earth, so certainly we believe that our universe hasn't been around forever. But even the scientific consensus today has lined up behind what's called the Big Bang Theory. Now, I have certain disagreements with that theory. Perhaps you do as well. But the point I want to draw from it is that the theory states that our universe had a beginning. That theory agrees with the creationist that our universe has not been around forever. But if our universe had a beginning, then who got it started? As some people have said before, a big bang requires a big banger. Someone had to get this whole thing going. It didn't just pop into existence on its own. So that observation has been used at times. A second observation has been made about the continued existence of the universe. Since our universe began to exist, it is what we call contingent. That just means it doesn't have to exist. It does exist, but it doesn't have to. And so that leads to the question, well, why does it still exist? There must be someone or something sustaining the universe in its existence. And so that's another observation that's been used to argue for a God who is keeping all things in existence. I think even the Apostle Paul in Acts chapter 17 makes something of an argument from the reality that God is sustaining all things in existence. When Paul says there that in him we live and move and have our being. A third observation that's been used is the fine-tuning of the universe to allow for human life. In recent decades in particular, scientists have discovered that human life could only exist within some astonishingly narrow parameters. If certain physical measurements in our universe were different by an extremely tiny amount, then human life couldn't even exist. And there are, I believe, a couple dozen of these measurements that have to be almost exactly what they are, down to an extremely small degree. And if any of them were different, then human life just couldn't simply exist here on Earth. This observation has sometimes been called the anthropic principle. So you might recognize that phrase if you've ever studied this topic before of making an argument for the existence of God. If that phrase is not familiar to you, don't worry about it. It might just be something to tuck away in the back of your mind. Or if you forget all about it after you listen to this episode, that's okay too. The fourth observation would be purposeful activity in the universe by non living things. Now, what does that mean? Well, think about something like the water cycle on Earth. It sure looks like it's happening for the purpose of watering the Earth. But clouds don't have a mind of their own. Evaporation doesn't have a mind of its own. So, where could this purpose possibly come from? It must come from a mind that is guiding and sustaining all of this. And so, observations like that have also been used to argue for the existence of God. A fifth observation would be the existence of information in cells. We have come to learn in recent decades that DNA is literally information encoded by patterns of physical matter. And our DNA contains an astonishing amount of information, a staggering amount of information. But information requires an informer. Someone, a mind, has to encode information. For example, if you saw sticks laid out on the ground in a pattern that formed an English word, well, you would know that that didn't just happen by chance. There's information being communicated through that pattern. And that's the kind of thing that we see in our own DNA. And as I said, we see a staggering amount of information encoded there. So, information conveyed by non living matter had to be put there by a living mind, something that can think and something that can actually intend to encode information. Now, another category of observations we could consider would be observations about human beings. So, the sixth observation here would be the universal religious need within human beings. We are an overwhelmingly religious race, and we always have been. I know right now, perhaps in Western civilization, we hear about atheism having something of a foothold in the minds of people or in our society, but historically and even around the world right now, atheism has never been a dominant point of view. We are overwhelmingly religious. We have this deep need within us that seems as if it can only be met through religious activity. But where did that come from? Why would we have such an impulse if there were not some kind of creator with whom we were supposed to connect? The whole idea of evolution doesn't seem to explain why we would have a need to worship, why we would have some kind of religious impulse. It really doesn't seem that we need it to survive. What kind of survival advantage would it give us? So, something like evolution doesn't seem to be able to explain our universal religious need. Then, along the same lines, we have observation number 7, the religious experiences of human beings. Humans throughout history have claimed that God has spoken to them, or that they had their prayers to God answered, or they've spoken of how they've been transformed by a confidence that Their sins have been forgiven by God. And so people have claimed to have had experiences with God. And how do we explain these things? Now, certainly some religious claims could be false, but all of them? The claims made in the Bible in particular have tremendous factual support to help us see that they are true. And so this is another indication of God's reality. An eighth observation would be the existence of the soul. The existence of the soul is vital for explaining the functions of the mind, like our conscience and our consciousness. And yet the soul is a non physical thing. I hope you realize that. The soul is not identical to the brain. And so we have to explain, though, where did it come from? If we have this non physical element to us, well, what produced that? How did we get that? That's something that evolution certainly cannot explain. And then there's a category of observations that we can draw from history, like a ninth observation here about the occurrence of miracles. Many people throughout history claim to have witnessed miracles. People living even still today claim to have witnessed miracles. Now, again, as with other religious experiences, it's possible that some of these claims certainly could be false. But again, all of them? The miracles recorded in the Bible have tremendous factual support to help us see that they actually did happen. But how could a supernatural event occur if there isn't anything beyond the natural? There has to be something beyond nature, something behind nature, something greater than nature if a true miracle is to occur. And so this also helps us to see the reality of God. A 10th observation we could point to would be the fulfillment of prophecy. How could it possibly happen that predictions could be made and then come to pass centuries later? And yet we see that very thing happening in the Bible. How could this happen without a supernatural being guiding the unfolding of history? We can barely even exert much of an influence on things that are likely to happen tomorrow. So, how could it possibly be the case that prophets could make predictions about things that were yet to come centuries down the road, and then see those predictions, those prophecies come true in detail? How could that happen if there is not a God? And then the 11th observation we could point to would be what we call a cumulative case. That's simply where we point to all of these different observations. And then we make a case like, if God doesn't exist, what are the odds that all of the above observations would be true? It seems completely impossible that all of these observations could be true if God doesn't exist. And so that cumulative case argument just sort of uses all of these different observations to add more weight and more weight behind the claim that God exists. Now, these observations that I mentioned here are just a small number of the total number of observations that have been used over the centuries as people have tried to show others that there really is a God. Reality all around us testifies to its creator. As Psalm 19 says, the heavens are telling the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. Well, we could spend a long time talking about each of these observations in detail, and also working to shore up the support that they actually offer for the existence of God. Perhaps you're already familiar with the fact that skeptics at different times have challenged each and every one of these observations. And so there certainly are important questions that I haven't dealt with today in just this brief survey. But in the next episode, as I said earlier, we're going to do a deep dive into an observation about morality. In that episode, we'll try to give a fully fleshed out argument for the existence of God based on the existence of objective moral standards that we as human beings are obligated to follow. Where could such standards come from? And how could we explain their existence if there is no God? So we'll talk about that. We'll also try to deal with some objections to that argument, because certainly some objections have been raised at times. And so I hope you will look forward to that next episode as we continue to think about how to be sure and secure in our Christian faith. Thanks for listening today.